Hello everyone, I'm the Enforcer, and welcome back to the Breaking News. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and support us on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Starting off on some of our breaking news of the day, we have heard that the Ukrainians and the country of Turkey have signed an arms alliance with each other to help with the further procurement of weapons and other kinds of munitions. This was reported by Nexta today on Twitter, and it says that the Ukrainians and Turks have signed a memorandum of understanding in strategic industries. Among the areas of cooperation is the development of drone production. An arms alliance like this has rarely been seen so far in the war, being engaged upon by Ukraine and another country, and this is one of the first that we have seen. It appears that it is an attempt to probably try and streamline the production of drone systems, such as the Baykar company's Bayraktar drones, which the Ukrainians have been using to a fairly effective degree, among many other kinds. The Ukrainians and the Turks have had a continuous relationship so far in the war, particularly through the Baykar company and the provisions of munitions, equipment, and most particularly drone warfare. And it appears that that will further continue at this moment, and it seems as though the Ukrainians and the Turks are trying to streamline this process to make it a little bit more effective and efficient. As a matter of fact, considering that it is a treaty of cooperation for the most part, which is an arms alliance, it appears that this may be an attempt to probably move Baykar factories directly into Ukraine, where the drones and equipment could be made directly at the source instead of being made in Turkey and then transported through Bulgaria and Romania to Turkey, or through the Black Sea to a Romanian port and then further on into Ukraine. Regardless, it is a incredibly interesting development and a very forward one as well. We have never seen a NATO country up till this point sign any kind of arms cooperation agreements with the Ukrainians or an arms alliance. And this is the first of its kind that has ever been seen, and probably most surprisingly, coming from the nation of Turkey. Many people didn't really expect that the Turks would be this on board with the war in Ukraine and supporting the Ukrainians throughout the rest of the war, but it appears that after Erdogan won his re-election, Erdogan has doubled down on supporting Ukraine and helping the war effort to keep on going. Not only that, but as another sign of cooperation and furthering friendship in between the Turks and the Ukrainians, the Azov Commanders, who have been exiled to Turkey ever since the surrender of the Azovstal last year, finally were able to return home to Ukraine and met President Zelensky on their way to the aircraft leaving Turkey. We can see right here Zelensky standing by the aircraft that brought him to Turkey with some Ukrainian staffers, and we can now see them unloading the Azov Commanders that held the Azovstal last year in Mariupol. This is one of the first times that we've seen the Azov Commanders since last year. During the surrender agreement made in between the Azov Commanders, the Ukrainian government, and the Russian Federation, the commanders of the Azov Battalion did not join the rest of their soldiers in the prisoner of war camps, and instead were sent by a third party, the Turks, to Turkey to live in exile there until the war ended. At least that was the agreement last year. And this particular video that y'all are seeing has actually been causing a large amount of stir, particularly with the Russians, as they are now incredibly upset with the Turkish government and the fact that they have released the Azov commanders back into Ukrainian hands. The agreement last year was made on the faith that Turkey will remain something of a neutral negotiating power throughout the course of this war, and it appears that the Turks are now ditching that neutral persona as a negotiator in the war, and they are now going all on board with being pro-Ukrainian and supporting the Ukrainian war effort. That's the end of that clip, but great to see that those commanders are finally returning back to Ukraine, and hopefully they'll be able to return and live out a normal life with their families. Speaking of a drone alliance and the friendship that we see further developing in between Ukraine and Turkey over arms alliances, it appears that the Russians are trying to step up their drone game as well. Historically, throughout the entire course of the war, the Russian drone effort has been getting into a far worse state as the war has progressed, and we have rarely ever seen the Russian drone effort even get close to being the level at which the Ukrainians have. The Ukrainians, of course, can count on largely the entirety of the Western world's drone technology to give them an upper hand in the war, and we've also seen that the Ukrainians have used their ability to buy Western computer parts and components to make some of their own drones, and some of these drones are honestly more impressive than and more capable than some of the drones that we've seen that have been produced by the West and then shipped to Ukraine in support of the war effort. The Russians have always been trying to further perfect and hone this area because drone warfare is certainly the next direction as far as warfare is going in the modern world. And it appears that in an attempt to do such a thing, they are building a new facility in the city of Omsk, which is almost in the middle of Siberia. The Ural mountain range is near Yekaterinburg over here, and everything east of that is largely considered to be Asia and also Siberia as well. So this city is almost in the middle of nowhere as far as Russia goes. And according to the Institute for the Study of War, the governor of the Omsk Oblast, Vitaly Kosenko, stated that on July 7th, Omsk Oblast universities will create a drone research center in the city in accordance with Russian President Putin's order to increase drone production. This appears to be some kind of an attempt, once again, to further close the gap in between the Russians and the Ukrainians as far as drone technology is concerned, but the chances of that ever occurring are quite slim. The Russians do not have a computer industry to speak of. It is practically non-existent, and it relies entirely on Western imports of computer parts and components to function at all. And the fact that the Russians are trying to find some way to create drones or further perfect them is going to be an ill-fated expedition at all, if even possible, because there's going to be no drone technology to really work with. The Russians don't produce it. The Russians do not have the industrial ability to produce in mass that kind of technology. They would have to rely on the imports of Western countries to make any further drone technological improvements possible. And considering that they have massive sanctions, and while we've seen some of those sanctions in the luxury goods sphere, such as fast food restaurants, such things fail, from what we understand, the sanctions on the import of weapons and also computer technologies into Russia is strictly enforced, and we haven't really seen that broken, and we haven't gotten any indications that the Russians have been getting access to computer technologies that they otherwise wouldn't be able to without the sanctions in place. And so, while that seems to be an effort to try and step up their drone warfare sphere, it is most likely going to be unsuccessful. Or they may make some technological advances, but they will not have the industrial ability to produce the advances that they have now created. So they're currently at a dead end at that point, and their drone warfare avenue will not be progressing any further, while Ukraine's arms alliance with Turkey will be helping them to further expand the gap in between Russian drone abilities and Ukrainian drone abilities. On top of that, the Russians are facing a little bit of a problem, and those drones that they hypothetically could make if they had the industrial ability will probably be needed fairly soon, as the Freedom of Russia Legion, completely separate this time from the Russian Volunteer Corps, both of them together were called the Russian Liberation Army. The Freedom of Russia Legion's leader has announced that there will be another raid on Russian territory. Of course, the location of this raid is unknown at the moment, but this was put up around an hour and a half ago, meaning that this raid will most likely be happening within this day. So we'll be waiting to see what kind of raid they conduct and how successful it is. From what we're hearing from British intelligence sources as well as Ukrainian intelligence sources, there are no strategic reserves left in Russia, and the border is heavily underdefended. And so this time, if the Freedom of Russia Legion wanted to send this whole thing entirely home and go all the way to Belgrade or Kursk, it may be entirely possible for them to make it to those major cities and actually capture them. And that'll start to show that the Russian forces are incredibly weak, as they really are non-existent except for on the front lines in Ukraine. And we're even hearing more about that once more from the Institute for the Study of War. They are speaking, like we've been saying for a couple of days, that Russian forces are becoming far more brittle and far more less flexible, the best word to put it, in the southern front, really across the entirety of the front line. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the deployment of almost the entirety of the Russian eastern grouping of forces and extensive SMD elements to the front line in southern Ukraine suggests that Russian defenses in southern Ukraine may be brittle. And this appears to be the case, from what we understand. The Russians have pulled almost all of their combative forces from around Russia and have put them into Ukraine at this moment, and in hopes to try and hold that front line. They are completely inflexible at this moment. With no reserves to count on, there's no way to rotate units off of the front lines any longer, and the front lines remain stagnant, and the Russian forces that are there have to remain on that front line until they are destroyed or until the war ends. So there's really no way for these lines to be as flexible and as dynamic as they used to be. They are incredibly stagnant, and that is creating a decent amount of brittleness for these Russian forces, as they may eventually break, and beyond that point there will be no recovery. There's not even going to be Russian reserves to fill in those gaps. So in several weeks or several months' time, we could see that the Ukrainians have shattered a Russian brigade in the southern front, and then there will be a large breakthrough that occurs in that specific area because there just won't be anything left to stop Ukrainian forces beyond that point. Moving on from that, we've also heard that the Russians may still be able to rely on the Wagner. The information about the Wagner unit and its fate after the failed coup attempt is still odd. We don't really know what's going on anymore, to be entirely honest with y'all. We're hearing many different stories, and a lot of them have validity to them and have honest parts about them, but it still is just not really creating a full picture. And from what we saw in the city of Krasnodar, we heard today that it is possible, and this came from Reuters, that Wagner is still not in Belarus and they're preparing to move to Belarus. But then at the same time, Lukashenko is also saying that the Wagner unit is not coming to Belarus and they're not in Belarus, and Prigozhin isn't even in Belarus. So at this point, it is completely unknown what is happening with the Wagner. Someone called up the Wagner just days after the coup and asked them where in the world would they go if they wanted to join, and they were told to go to the small town of Molkin. And this base right here that we're seeing on satellite footage is the Wagner's camp. We're not sure if this is still operational or not. According to the phone call that was made by a Russian investigative journalist around 3 weeks ago, it appears that this base was still operational even a week after the coup, and the Wagner unit was still holding it down. That may be the case now. It's not that far from the city of Krasnodar itself, one of the major cities here in the Caucasus Mountain region of Russia. So we don't really know. They could still be there. The Russians could still plan on keeping them around, because it does pose a large amount of problems if the Wagner unit is to be completely dissolved and become either an official part of the Russian government or be exiled to Belarus. The Russians count on the Wagner unit to be their strong arm outside of Russia unofficially, and have been able to help the Syrians, the Assad regime, in the civil war, and they've also been currently involved in the Sudanese coup, among many other armed conflicts that are occurring within Central Africa. And so if the Wagner unit ceases to exist, like it may, that starts to pose a massive problem for Russia, and they have to now find a way to continue to strong arm in the Middle East and Central Africa without the Wagner, which was their only vehicle to do those things without the Russian government being directly involved in those conflicts and those affairs, which brings a whole different diplomatic air about it, because with the Wagner involved, there's a decent amount of deniability that the Russians can have that those units are not really representing the Russian government or the Russian nation's interests. Without the Wagner, and if the Russian army or the Russian government has to go down there officially, then it's looked at differently by countries by the United States. Now the Russians are directly meddling in places like the Middle East and Central Africa, and then we may possibly get involved, or it may create a diplomatic standoff where the Russians have to give concessions. And so destroying the Wagner group, as was supposed at the very beginning of the end of the failed coup, may not be beneficial for the Russians, and that's why we're seeing a lot of limbo area being created around the fate of the Wagner, and seeing that they still haven't dissolved 3 weeks after the coup ended. But with that, that is really all of the major news we have today. And to give you all a little bit of a summary of what's going on behind the scenes, unfortunately, we will not be running a short war summary, well, not a short war summary, but a nightly war stream tonight. Every single day, 6 days a week, we run a 3.5 hour long or 3 hour long stream about the war's news and also answer questions about the war. But we will not be able to do that tonight because my co-host Enforcer Matt is incredibly sick again and needs to recover. And so we'll be cutting out tonight's stream, and Matthew will also not be present for tomorrow's stream either. But I plan on running that one regardless because it is the Sunday fundraiser. And I'll try and find a way to make that work without a co-host being on the air. But with that, I thank you all so much once again for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one.